Hey everybody, looks like we got 2 people so far. Go ahead and give a shout out in the chat. Let me know who's here. Let me know that you can hear me. Cool. Alright, so, as I said, hey all, tonight is about JavaScript, the early weeks of JavaScript, week 6 through 10. So, beginning and intermediate JavaScript, we're not going to hit jQuery. It's not going to be strict HTML and CSS. I want to keep it in that range. As with the last time, the course of this discussion is up to you guys. I will read the room as best I can, so to speak. But in the meantime, I'll throw together some additional mini project ideas that we can work through, and hopefully will help you to get some quality practice and learn something in the process. If you're watching along with this video, I highly suggest coding along with it. Okay? Especially if you're watching the recording in the future. You have no excuse to not code along with this video. You can pause it, you can turn on subtitles, and all that jazz. Alright, so I'm just going to get started. If you have any questions at any point, if there's something specific you want to see or talk about, just toss it in the chat and I will address them as soon as I can. But in the meantime, these weeks, they pretty much start out focused on a couple of things, like selecting and manipulating HTML elements from your JavaScript, and creating new HTML elements and content. Those, I'd say, are the 2 primary skills that are the focus of these first 5 weeks of JavaScript. However, I don't want you to not be able to see the forest for the trees in practicing those skills. A lot of times students will very much understand what the process is for creating new elements, putting content in those elements, and putting those elements on their HTML document. But you need to understand what's happening under the hood. And when I say that, the most important question for me, and the most important question I want all of you guys to ask yourselves constantly when you're dealing with JavaScript, is the simple question of what data type is this? What data type is this? It is the single most important question you need to ask yourself every step of the way. JavaScript boils every line of code that you write down to a data type. And those data types are numbers, strings, booleans, arrays, objects. Additionally, there's null and undefined, but we're not going to spend any time on those. Okay, so anytime you write a line of code in JavaScript, no matter what it is, no matter what variables it contains, no matter what you're trying to do, you need to understand and be aware of which of these data types that line of code is going to evaluate to when your code runs. And if you're not sure, your console is the very best place to test it out. Okay? So as a quick example of what I'm talking about, this isn't something you'd really encounter in the wild, but it is something that you should have a process for determining. If I asked you what the data type is for this line of code, what would you tell me? What is that data type? What is this going to evaluate to? All right, well, there's obviously a lag, so I don't even know if you guys have heard my question yet, but I'm just going to push on ahead. If you know already, great. Check it. If you don't know, check it. The way you check it is you copy it. You open up your console in your Chrome Developer Tools. I don't know why my console is all the way down there. You open up your console, paste it in your console, and hit enter. And what comes back is a 1. I don't care what the value is. I don't care if it's 1, I don't care if it's 0, I don't care if it's 500. I do care that this is a number. That's what is important to me. Okay? So there are a lot of these, like this. What data type is this? Well, we know that anything in quotes is a string. We know that this hello is a string. But dot length changes what we're dealing with here. The browser is going to evaluate this statement. It's not going to take hello independently and dot length independently. This is all one line of code that evaluates to one single value, and that value is also a number. Okay? If I have an array, currently the data type of this is an array. If I add an index to it, what data type am I dealing with? This will evaluate to one single common denominator, or one single element, component, item, however you want to think of it. What data type is this going to evaluate to? This is an array, and then the index changes what we're referring to. It gives me a string. At the same time, what is this data type? You should be aware that it's going to be a number. We're getting a specific item from inside this array. All right, so at the end of the day, any code that you write is going to evaluate to, as I said, one of these data types. And you can never ask yourself what data type you're dealing with too many times. Too many students I've seen take this stuff for granted. They memorize ways of doing things, or they have practiced ways of doing things, and that's great, but the second an input into a function that you're very used to changes, the second that you're dealing with a string rather than a number, or vice versa, the whole process breaks down, and that shouldn't be the case. That shouldn't be the case. It always comes down to make sure you're dealing with the right data type. And if you're not, figure out why or figure out how to get there. Alright, anyway, that's my soapboxing for the moment. Not a whole lot of you there, so go figure. Anyway, for selecting and manipulating HTML elements, I thought we'd get started by creating a functioning image carousel with nothing but vanilla JavaScript, okay? No Bootstrap, no special Bootstrap components or anything like that, just regular old JavaScript. We're going to make an image carousel. There are a lot of different ways to do this, so the way I'm going to show you is definitely not the only way, but it is a reliable one. And this is actually something I have received as a technical test before from a potential employer, to literally make an image carousel using no plugins, no frameworks, no nothing, no additional tools. Okay, so I've got 3 images in my image folder. I'm going to rename them all so they're consistently named. And we're just going to use these as our 3 images that we're going to switch between. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to create a div in my HTML, given an ID of image container, or, yeah, image container. Okay, and I'm going to leave it empty. Now let's jump into CSS. I'm going to select my image container, my element with the ID of image container. I'm going to give it a background color so we can see it. I'm going to make sure it's the full width of my page. It should be automatically, but I'm just going to add that in just in case. And I'm going to make it 500 pixels tall. Save, load my page. There's my image container there. This is where I want to see our images. Okay. Now, what I'm not going to do is actually use image elements for this. I'm not going to use image elements the way that you might in a Bootstrap component. Instead, I'm going to take a background image approach to this. Background image approach. Okay, so from JavaScript, first I want to set myself up a variable which refers to this div with the ID of image container. A shorthand that I can easily use to select, target, and manipulate this div with the ID of image container. It is the primary focus of this exercise, so rather than write something like document.getElementById image container 12 times, I'm going to write it once, store it in a variable, and use that variable as a shorthand to always refer to this div. Okay, so let's dive in. Var, I'm going to call it my div. Keep it simple. And my div is going to be equal to document.getElementById image container. Okay, now if you've made it this far, I want you to stop. For the love of all that is holy, I want you to stop. I want you to reload your page. I want you to open your console. And before you write any additional code, I want and need and require you to check your variable. You simply type it into your console and you see what comes back. You see what your variable contains. Okay, I cannot tell you how many times I have students come to me with questions that would have been resolved if they simply took the time to check their variables when they create them. This is all you got to do. Open your console and type the name of your variable. See what comes back. So my div now contains the div with the ID of image container. Okay? Anywhere in my code where I might have written document.getElementById image container, I can now replace that with simply my div. My div and document.getElementById image container are now one and the same. That's what I've done here. If you know this already, great. Don't take it for granted. Understand what's really happening here. These two lines of code now evaluate to exactly the same thing. They boil down to the exact same thing. So my follow-up question as to that is, what is their data type? Somebody tell me. I can wait all night. Come on, guys. Wrong answer is still an answer. Tony, thank you for chiming in. String. No, it is not a string. Conceptually, my div, the variable, contains the div with the ID of image container, right? So we understand that. We're capable of understanding that the myDiv variable contains a div. It contains an HTML element. So I ask you, what data type is an HTML element in JavaScript? Well, let's think about it. How can we now manipulate this HTML element now that we have it targeted? We have used things like .InnerText to insert some text into an HTML element. That works. My text has been injected. We can use style.background color to change the background color of an element. We can even give the element classes using JavaScript. Now if I call my div, we can see this is a div with the ID of image container, class of my new class, and a style attribute equal to background color red, and it contains some text. We have manipulated the HTML element contained in this variable in 3 different ways, all from our JavaScript. Now, looking a little more closely at what you see on my screen, at the syntax that I'm using, do you still think my div is a string? Because to the best of my knowledge, the only way in which we've seen strings using similar syntax is something like hello.length. We have seen things like hello.toUppercase to convert a string to all uppercase, but we have never seen some string dot something equals something new. This is a particular syntax that we have never seen before because it doesn't work. You cannot apply logic like this to a string. So, what data type is an HTML element in JavaScript? What other kind of data type uses dot notation like this? It's an object. Thank you, Sandeep. HTML elements in JavaScript are objects. All of them, without question, without exception. Every single HTML element is an object. Therefore, the myDiv variable contains an object. So treat it like an object. Okay? That's something I need you to walk away with from this. You need to understand that myDiv is an object. That HTML elements are objects. And as such, they have properties. Properties like inner text. Properties like style. Properties like class name. This div in particular probably looks something like this if we were to write it as an object literal. It would have a tag name property equal to div. It would have an inner text property equal to some text. It would have a class name property equal to my new class. It would have a class list property equal to an array containing strings. Only one string, but strings. It's obviously got an inner HTML property. And it's got a style property, which is an object itself, which contains things like color, empty string, background color, red, etc., etc., etc. Every CSS property under the sun is contained in that style object, which is a property of the element object. And what we're doing when we use this kind of syntax to manipulate an HTML element is we're replacing the content, well, not tag name, we're replacing the content of one or more of these properties. When I set my div.innerText to the value of some text, a string, it replaces what was originally an empty string inside this property with a string that now says some text. That's what we're doing. In the same way, let's create a very simple person object, which simply has a name property equal to Evan and an age property equal to 29. Two properties. That's it. One object, two properties. But I can access the name property of the person object, or I can change the name property of the person object. And now that person object has an entirely different name from what it had originally. This is exactly what we're doing when we manipulate HTML elements from our JavaScript. We're selecting the element object, we're selecting a property inside that object, and we're assigning a new value to it. And this person object, this example that we have up here, I can also add new properties to it. Let's add a gender. Now, person has 3 properties. Let's change the age. Person still has 3 properties, but now name is Matt and age is 50. Same syntax, same pattern, same principle. Okay? I need you guys to understand that. So, long story short, elements are objects. We now have a variable which selects our div with the ID of image container in our HTML. Let's go ahead and insert a background image to my div. And I'm going to do this by selecting my object, selecting the style property of that object, selecting the background image property of style object of the myDiv object, and I'm going to set it equal to my image folder /portrait1.jpg. Yep. Don't forget, guys, stop me if you have any questions at all. Save. Reload. And we have an image in my div. Now, can anyone tell me why my image file path is image/portrait1.jpg and not /image/portrait1.jpg, which, by the way, will not work. Let me comment out this line. Think about that and tell me, but if I add a background image from my CSS, then we need that ... We need that ... first. But from our JavaScript, that ... actually breaks it. Can anyone tell me why? Come on, there's 6 of you out there. The / in img is already prompting the script to look in the image folder. That's true, but let's take a step back. In this case, the / is telling our browser to first exit the directory it's currently sitting in. Then, to look for the image folder and go inside and look for portrait1.jpg. It's an entirely different image file path. The / is necessary here because I'm inside my CSS style sheet, which is inside my CSS folder. There's an extra step to get to my portrait1 from my CSS style sheet than from, say, my index. That .. all it means is exit the current directory, go up 1 level, then go to image, then go to portrait1. The reason why we need that in our main.css is because that extra step is required to get to that final file from our CSS, from our style sheet. The reason why we don't need it in our JavaScript is because, I ask you again, can JavaScript actually change CSS? The answer is no. JavaScript cannot change CSS. So, when I write this in my JavaScript, where do you think this is going? It's not being injected into this selector here in my main.css style sheet. It's being injected directly into the HTML as a style attribute. You see that there? Style equals background image URL image / portrait1.jpg. This style attribute is in my HTML. To get to portrait1 from my HTML, that .. is not required. In the same way that if I were to add an image element here and use the source to link to image portrait1, I would still not use that .. I don't need to first exit my directory. I can go straight from index.html to my image folder. It's important that you understand where this is going to exist after your page loads. And what JavaScript does is it injects it into a style attribute of your HTML tag. So, from your HTML, you need to tell the browser how to find your image, not from your CSS. That is something you need to keep in mind. And this same principle applies to any time you're writing JavaScript that affects HTML. You need to be able to picture, to visualize, to imagine how it should look on the other side. After it's rendered, after it comes out, if you're coding your comment app, what should the HTML for your page look like when there are already 3 comments written and existing on your page? What should that HTML look like? And how do you get there from what it looks like without those comments? You have to paper prototype that stuff out. Okay, so I know that background image property is going to get injected to a style attribute in my HTML. So the file path that I use should reflect that it's going to be in my HTML, not my CSS. And that is why I don't use the double dots for a background image that is added in JavaScript. So now that we've added our background image, let's add a couple more properties, like let's do my div.style.background size. Set it to cover, just to make sure it always covers the div. And my div.style.background position. Let's do center, just to make sure we always have the middle of the image, whatever that may be. And that should be good. That gives us a single background image in our div. Now to turn this into a carousel, we need, for example, the image to change when we click on something, maybe. So let's keep it simple first and put in a button for next. And we'll give this button an onClick attribute, which triggers a function called changeImage. Okay. Now we're going to refactor this function a couple times probably, so the first iteration of it is not going to be the cleanest version, but it will get us there. We're going to take this one step at a time. So we know we're going to need that changeImage function, and this changeImage function is going to change pretty much this, just the background image property of my div. We need to know what to change it to, however. So let's set ourselves up with an array of strings containing all the file paths to all three of our images. No questions from you guys? You're pretty quiet. Alright, so we have an array now. I'm going to separate these out just so we can see everything very clearly, containing all three of our image file paths. Very straightforward. And we know we're going to need to plug one of these in the beginning, and we're going to need to change it when the changeImage function runs. So first, let's replace what we have in here with a more dynamic variable. Let's change it to images at the 0 index. Make sure that it still works. Still works. Okay. Now when we click on Change Image, we want to basically do this exact same thing, right? Except we want to change it to images at the 1 index. Reload, click my button. Change image is no, oh, I spelled it wrong. Change image. Let's reload. Click the button again, and it changes the image. Okay, so it works. If I click it again, nothing else happens. But we're on the right track. We know we have the right logic here. To make this more dynamic, we need something more significant here in place of the 0 and the 1. That reflects which index of images we should be loading into our div. So let's go ahead and create ourselves, say, a counter variable and set it equal to 0. Counter variables are really, really useful in JavaScript. I use them all the time. Okay, so now counter contains a number. The data type of counter is a number. The data type of images is an array. The data type of my div is an object. So I can use counter any place that I might otherwise use a number. So I'm going to replace this 0 with my counter variable. And it's the same thing. Same thing. Function still works. Everything still works. It's the same thing because counter is the same thing as writing 0. It evaluates to 0 at this point in time. Let's also put counter in here. Let's do counter plus 1. See if it still works. Still works. So far so good, but this still doesn't make a whole lot of sense as a piece of dynamic logic. Counter plus 1 in here. Instead, how about when we click on our button, we actually add 1 to the counter variable. So when counter gets plugged in here, it should no longer equal 0. It should now equal 1. See if it still works. Still works. So far, so good. In fact, now we should be able to click this twice. But as soon as I click it a third time, we get an error. Why is that? Because when I click it the first time, counter becomes 1. And we get portrait 2. When I click it a second time, counter becomes 2. And we get portrait 3. When I click it a third time, counter becomes 3. And there is no item, no string, at the third index of images. So, we need an if statement. If counter, let's say, is greater than 2, then counter equals, let's have it go back to 0. So it goes back to the beginning. If counter is greater than 2, then counter becomes 0. And 0 gets plugged in here. 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2. And now we have a loop. Okay, so that kind of works. That's a start. But what if we also want a back button? Well, I don't want to write a whole second function, but let's start that way. Okay, I'll change this to change image back. We'll write a second function, copy the change image function, rename it to change image back, and it's all going to be the same except counter is going to subtract 1, and if counter is less than 0, then counter equals 2. Let's try that. See if that works. Next, 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 back, 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 back. Okay, so far so good. They both work. And they will work infinitely. What if I want it to stop at the last image, though? I don't want you to be able to continue to cycle through. I want you to be able to stop and have to go back. Well, then let's change our logic a little bit. This line of code, which changes the background image of our div, is only going to run if counter is not greater than 2. So let's start by putting this inside an else statement. Okay? And if counter is greater than 2, then we're going to make sure that counter equals 2, the final image. So if counter goes above 2, it's going to be immediately reset to 2. It will never be allowed to go above the number 2. Okay? Let's see. Next, next, and we stop. Okay, so far so good. Now let's do the same for our back function. So if counter is less than 0, counter equals 0. Same logic, same principle. Let's make sure that it works. Can't go forward, can't go back. So far so good. Now if you made it that far, cool. You've got it. That's great. That's the baseline functionality. Let's make this feel a little better first. To start, I'm going to add a transition element to my image container. Something like 0.5 seconds ease. Something that we've used a lot for hover effects, right? Well, how's that going to affect our app? Can you tell? There might be a bit of a lag or delay in the screen time that makes it difficult to see. So let me change this to something like 1.5 seconds. Make it a very slow transition. See, now our images are fading from one to the other. And our function still works. Let me put this at 1 second. I feel like that's a good middle ground. Okay, so now we have a nice fade in between our images in our makeshift carousel. So far, so good. Now that's also a nice little touch, which if you made it there on your own, bravo for you. Only suggestion I'd make now is we need to refactor our functions. Okay? This is something that I want a lot of you guys to start thinking about as you're heading into weeks 8, 9, 10. As you're starting to deal with more functions, or more buttons, or multiple functions at the same time, I want you to try your best to think about how you can take advantage of functional arguments. We teach you guys arguments in week 6 and week 7, but then I find that a lot of students stop using them, which is a shame, because they can make things really, really easy. Okay, so for example, I want both my next and back button to use the same function. The same exact function, but that function is going to behave differently for each button. The way we can determine that is by using an argument, such as, let's keep it simple for now and do a string next as an argument inside the change image function triggered by the next button, and string back as an argument of the change image function triggered by the back button. Same function, different argument. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Feel free to stop me if you have questions. Now that we've done that, we need to refactor our change image function to encompass both of these functionalities. So I'm going to copy this, comment it out, paste it up here, and we know that change image is going to take a function, some string. Okay, some string. I mean an argument. It's going to take an argument of some string. And we know that if the string is next, this is the code we want to execute. If the string is back, this is the code we want to execute. So let's go ahead and bring these functions together and just put in a bigger if statement. If string equals next, then we're going to do all of this. Otherwise, we're going to do all of this. Okay, here I'll add some comments. Okay, so now we have the same function governing two different processes, both the forwards and back buttons of our image carousel. Let's see if it still works. Reload, next, 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 back, 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 next again, still works. Okay, so we have refactored two functions into one using an argument. I hope that made sense. Okay, so now our image carousel is basically ready to go. Our buttons are pretty atrocious, and we could probably style them better. So why don't we do that? I'm going to change the content of the back button to a left chevron, also known as the less than sign. It's above your comma. And the next button to a right chevron, or the greater than sign, above your period. They're the angle brackets, essentially. Okay, but now they are the actual text content of each button for left and right, forwards and backwards, as we're familiar with. We've all used buttons that look like this, right? And there they are. Zoom in. There's our buttons now, left and right. Still work, still good. So let's now style them. I'm going to go into CSS. I'm going to select all my buttons. First, I'll give them a big font size, so they're nice and big. Then I'm going to try to get rid of their background. Then I'm going to try to get rid of their border. Okay. Now, something else I want to do is I want to make my arrow turn into a pointer when I hover over them. So to do that, there's a cursor property in CSS, which I'm going to set to pointer. And now my arrow turns into that little hand pointing when I hover over either button. Simple as that. Okay, so we're almost there. I'm also going to set them to position absolute, and I'm going to set them to, I'm going to give them a height of 50 pixels and a top property of 225 pixels. So now they're both right here. And I want to have the left one here on the left and the right one here on the right. My buttons don't have any kind of ID or any kind of class, so I'm going to have to get creative with how I select them if I don't want to give them an ID or class. It's okay if you wanted to. It's definitely a good suggestion for a use case like this, but I'm going to take this opportunity to show you some extra ways of selecting elements like that. I could use something like nth child, and that will select the button which is the third child of its parent. So this button, because the div is the first child, this button is the second child, this is the third child. Let's just see if that works. I'm going to give it a property of right, 0. And there we go. maybe want to increase that to something like 5 pixels. Yeah, 5 pixels, that'll do. Okay, so that selector works, but Adrian brought up a really good point during the last webinar that the nth child selector can seem pretty unreliable. It's really easy to mess it up, and that's absolutely true. So I'm going to use what's called an attribute selector instead. And an attribute selector in CSS allows you to select an element by its attribute, such as its onClick attribute. So this is going to select the button, which has an onClick attribute equal to change image with the back argument. Let's see if it works. Ooh, I switched them. Next, that's the one that I want. There we go. Still works. All's well. Last thing, I'm just going to make them white. There we go. Back, next, next, back, and we have a functioning image carousel using entirely vanilla JavaScript. One function, nice and clean, single array of 3 strings. Only refactoring I would suggest you do at this point is we want to change this to, right? Because let's say I want to add more images to my carousel. If I wanted to add them to my array here, I wouldn't want to have to change this to every time I add a new image. So we're going to use images.length. If counter is greater than images.length, then counter equals images.length. Is that right? What do we know? It's images.length minus 1. Excuse me for a second there. Okay? If you're confused about that, well, let's talk about it. Those parentheses. So the length of images, images.length, is 3. The length of images is 3. The last item in images is at the second index. So images.length minus 1 is 2. Last item in images is images at the index of images.length minus 1. So that's how we use a more dynamic variable, a more dynamic stand-in for that previously hard-coded number to keep our app nice and dynamic, to keep our logic sound. Now it doesn't matter how many images are in this array, this will still work. And if this were part of a full app, and this array were pulled from a server somewhere or through an API, doesn't matter how many items it contains, our one function would still work in all cases. And there we go. Any questions about that? Alright, well I'm going to run to the restroom real fast and I'll be right back. So there's 8 of you here, only 3 of you have said anything. So please let me know who's listening. And please do let me know if you have any questions. Now that we've gotten through this, though, let's go ahead and make an image carousel that's a little bit more sophisticated. This time using image elements rather than background images. Okay, so I'm going to delete all of my JavaScript. I'm going to delete most of my CSS. Yeah, that's fine. Hey, well. Yep, let's see, image container. Let's give it a width of, actually, I'm going to delete everything. Okay, so we're back to, I'll leave my buttons, but I will get rid of their attributes. So now we're going to do the same thing, but with image elements, and it's going to end up looking a little bit better. So inside of image container, I'm going to create my 3 image elements. One, 2, and 3. And currently our images are way too big. So I'm going to jump into CSS, select them, give them all a width of 33%. Okay, they're all the same height, which is nice, but if they weren't, we could make them the same height. They're all sitting next to each other, like so. Currently our buttons are non-functional. So we have our 3 image elements. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the white space in between them. Like so. And let's up that to 33.3. Okay, good enough. And I want to treat this carousel kind of like a viewfinder, where we're only going to be able to see one image at a time. And when you click a button, all 3 images are going to slide to the left or to the right to reveal the next image. Okay, so to give you an idea of what I mean, let me select image container and give it a width of 50 VW. Okay, it's exactly 50% of my window. Make sure it's centered. Give it a background color. Actually, I'll give it a border for now. Okay, and we can see my images are obviously too small. My images are obviously too small, and that's because I made sure they all have a width of 33%. Well, now, what if I give my images also a width of 50 VW? So each of my 3 images is going to be the same width of the container. Well, now they're going to stack like this. We don't want that, though. We don't want that at all. So we're going to need to use some overflow here. Oh, no, I'm sorry. What we need to do is simply give image container a very specific height. So let's say 350 pixels. Okay, so now you can see that the height of image container is too short. The images are actually overflowing. And that's fine. But I need to get them to line up horizontally. So I'm going to put them inside their own element inside image container. Call it inner image container. And give it a width of 150 VW. There we go. So now my images line up left to right. Now if I take image container and apply overflow hidden to it, we only see one image at a time. So we're getting closer to what we want. Now what I really want is when I push this button for all three of my images to slide over so that we go from one image to the next, just like a viewfinder. So let's go ahead and redeclare our function. OnClick equals change image. Let's do back. And next. And in my JavaScript, declare our function. Do we need any other kinds of variables? Well, I'd like to be able to select this inner image container here. So I'm going to create a variable for that. Image container equals document.get element by ID inner image container. And let's say if string equals next, then what do we want to happen? Well, frankly, all we really need to do, image container dot style dot transform translate x minus 50 VW. So this div, which contains all three of our images, is simply going to move 50 viewport width 50 VW to the left. And we get to the next image. Okay, so far so good. Now let's also give that a transition property so we can see some animation there. And now it slides. Okay, looks nice. The problem is we can't click the button again because it's still at the position of minus 50 VW. When we push the button again, we need it to go to minus 100 VW. This will allow us to jump all the way to that last image. Okay? So, if we need to replace this with something more dynamic, we're going to need another counter variable. So if string equals next, first, counter is going to go up by 1. And we are going to translate the div, which contains our images, by 50 times counter. So if counter is 1, it will be 50 VW. If counter is 2, it will be 100 VW. Reload. Slide to the right, slide to the right. Now, of course, we can keep sliding, which is not good, so we need to fix that. If counter is greater than, what's the number right now? 2. Counter is greater than 2. Oops. And counter equals, what do we want to happen? Counter equals 2. So it will stop at the end. 1, 2, stop. Okay, so that's next. Now let's do back. Else, it's going to be the same logic. Except we're going to subtract 1 from counter. And honestly, we don't need to change this line of code at all, I believe. Let's see. Forwards, forwards, backwards, backwards. But we need to prevent it from getting stuck there at the end. So if counter is less than 0, then counter equals 0. So far so good, but I see 2 lines of code that are repeated here. Yeah, so what we can do is get rid of them both and place them outside of this big old if-else statement. So all the if-else statement is governing is how counter changes. Either it goes up by 1 or it goes down by 1. So slide to the right, stop, slide to the left, stop, slide back to the right, etc. Good. So now we have a very different image carousel. It's very different. Questions you might have are, how do we get this too to be more dynamic? Well, we might need to do so by counting how many images are inside inner image container. So there's something we can use in JavaScript. Here, let me do this in my console first. Image container, which is an HTML element, it's an object, has a property called children. And children is an array of all of the elements it contains. And that array has a length of 3. So let's create a total images variable equal to image container dot children dot length, and we can replace that 2 with total images minus 1, just like we did in the previous example, and that will always work. Still works. Alright, so let's see. How else could we make this a little nicer or a little more dynamic? My biggest issue right now is that 50 VW is still hard-coded. So if I wanted to come into my CSS and suddenly change the size of my image carousel, well, then I'd be in trouble because I'd have to change a bunch of different things, right? So, first, let's get rid of the width on image container. Or rather, let's set the width of image container to 100%. Okay? We're obviously going to need to change some things. But let's jump into our console and see if we can access the width of image container from our JavaScript so that we can use that as a relative variable. Well, if I type in image container.style.width, I get an empty string. That's not useful to me. So let's explore that style property a little bit. Image container.style is itself an object. Let's open it up. And it's got all of these properties, but remember, these are the properties that will be injected in the style attribute in your HTML. So I can't actually get the CSS that I've written in my style sheet the way that you might think. That's a problem. Let's keep scrolling. Let's keep scrolling. Everything's empty. There's nothing here that we can use. So that's a problem. We can't access the width of this element the way that we would like. Does that make sense? So style isn't going to work. Let's see if there's another property that we can use, seeing if the console can actually do some of the work for us. Look at all of these properties of this one element that we can easily access from our JavaScript. Well, something that I did see all the way towards the top here was offset width. What do I think that is? I have no idea what that means. That's not very helpful to me, right? Oops. But image container, the variable, is actually this inner image container, isn't it? What if I want really to get the width of the div with the ID of image container? That's this one here that we're actually seeing. So let's add offset width to that. And that returns 967. Well, if I select this div in my Elements tab, you probably can't see it, but there in the right here, it pops up with the dimensions of this div, and one of them is a width of exactly 967 pixels. 967 pixels. So this is going to be the key to how I get the relative width of my div with the ID of image container. So let's go ahead and make a variable for it. Container width equals this, and let's add pixels on there. So we'll stringify this whole thing. Okay? And now, rather than 50 VW here, let's change the unit to pixels and change 50 to container width. Okay, so far so good. Last thing that we need to change is going to be this width of the inner image container, which is this variable here. So let's simply use JavaScript to set that width here. And we want it to be exactly 3 times the width of its parent. Container width times 3. We only only thing I'm going to have to do is get rid of that pixels there. Since we're adding it down here, and we don't want it here because we need this to be a number. Alright, so let's see. Whoop, we got some weirdness going on. Let's see what's going on. Oops. There we go. Okay. So is that working so far? Yes, it is. All that we need to change now is the width of our images. So let's get rid of that. And we need to select all the images on our page and assign them a width. So first, let's select all our image elements with something like document.get elements by tag name. And you got to be aware, what's the data type of this? Let's reload my page. Open up my console. Image elements. It contains, for all intents and purposes, an array of image objects, image elements. Okay? So we need to be aware of that. And we want to set the width of each object inside this array to this, the width of the container. And how do we set the width for each item inside the array? We use a for loop. Image elements at the I index, which is every individual image element, dot style dot width equals container width plus pixels. And we're basically future-proofing our app here by making sure that all of the relative sizes make sense and work. Look at that, it works perfectly. The height of our container is not appropriate at all. So, well, let's start by just doing something like 600 pixels. Okay? And it works perfectly. It's a nice slider. We're using purely vanilla JavaScript. And the beauty of this is it will work no matter how large my window is, because all of my dimensions are tied to each other. They're detected as soon as the page loads, and they're set by the JavaScript engine. Okay? So we're basically making our site even more responsive by using JavaScript to detect relative dimensions that we need to use as anchor points for other elements on our page. I mean, this is what selecting and manipulating HTML elements is all about. And there we have a nice, robust, vanilla JavaScript slider. Now, what you might have noticed is as soon as I change my browser window size, it doesn't work anymore, right? That's because we basically need all of this to happen every time the window changes size. So something I don't want to talk about today because it's really for future weeks. But what we can do is listen for a resize event on our window. And anytime the window is resized, we can change the dimensions that we set up here to whatever they need to be now, in the moment, now that the window has been changed. And even further, make our page completely responsive. Does that make sense? The only reason you do it this way is if you weren't sure how big your image container is going to be in the end. Okay, so just to demonstrate, it works like this, that's great. And if I want to change the size of my carousel, I only need to do so in one place. And it will still work. Okay, so I'm making it as easy as possible for whoever is handling this. Okay, ideally, you might have a front-end slider somewhere to determine how wide you want this carousel to be. And somebody who has no code experience whatsoever can simply select a width or a percentage or a size, and everything else will change to adapt. That's the principle that we're executing here. Okay, hope that makes sense. Anybody have any questions? It's a very quiet group tonight. I don't like quiet. All right, well then let's move on. If you guys don't have any questions, I'm just going to keep pushing forward. So, awesome. Let's make a quiz app. How about that? Good, I'm glad. Thanks, Will, for the feedback. And thanks, Holland, for sticking with it. Alright, so quiz app. Let's make this, let's see, how about a multiple choice quiz app? And one that has different states. So you're only going to see one question at a time with, 4 multiple choice options. Okay? So first, let's go ahead and set up our questions. So we're going to have a question, we're going to have 4 options, and we're going to have 1 correct answer. To me, that sounds like an array of objects. Question, what is the following data type? Or what data type does the following evaluate to? And the data, it's going to be, let's do a string, hello.length plus, there. Okay, that's one property, and then we're going to have an option 1 property of number, option 2 property, string, option 3 property, boolean, option 4, array, or undefined. And then correct is going to be option 2. This dot option 2. For those of you who've explored objects, can anyone remind me what this is in this context? So if I save this, reload, open my console, and type in questions, which is the array, at the 0 index, which is the object, dot correct, what's going to come back? Oops. So what I'm going to do is that. Alright, I can live with that. I'm not going to mess with setting up something crazy here, but this is going to, don't forget it, let's keep it simple. No methods just yet, we'll talk more about methods in the next webinar. Alright, so the correct answer is going to be string. And let's do 3 questions in total. Alright, 3 questions in total. Well, when you're, the answer is when you have a method inside of an object and you use the this variable inside that method, it refers to the object itself. So for example, the way that I had it set up for a minute there, but chose not to follow through with, was like this. And in this case, this, inside this function, inside the correct property, which is a method, okay, this is a method, a property of an object containing a function, the this variable here refers to the entire parent object. So, this object, dot option 2, is string. In fact, why not? I'm gonna do it. We're using a method here to determine the correct answer. This one should be option 1, and this one should be option 3. Okay, so correct is now a method. So, in the same way that we use document.getElementById, see those parentheses at the end of this getElementById? Document is an object. Dot notation implies properties of objects. So, document object, getElementById property, contains a function. So somewhere there is a document object which contains a getElementById property which contains a function which takes a string and returns an HTML element. Obviously this isn't the actual code, but this is how that principle works. GetElementById is a property of the document object, and we invoke it with an argument when we call it, when we want to use it, to return a specific HTML element. In the same way, I've set us up so that the correct property of each question object is also a method. Questions dot well, questions at the 0 index dot correct is the property, and it contains a function. But when I invoke it with parentheses, just like we do get element by ID, it returns the appropriate response. If I do it on one of the other questions, it returns the appropriate answer for that question. All right, so we've got all of our data set up now. Let's go ahead and start creating our elements. First, let's create a div. Document.create element div. Then let's create an h1. Document.create element h1. Let's give the h1 some content. New h1 dot inner text equals questions at the 0 index dot question. Now let's create new buttons. I'll create one button for every option, or 4 buttons for every question. These will be the multiple choice buttons. Okay? I'm going to use a for loop to do this, because I need to do it 4 times. I is less than 4, I plus plus, for new button equals document dot create element button, and inside the for loop, new button dot inner text equals, and we need option 1, option 2, option 3, and option 4 as the inner text of these buttons. Now this is where things might get a little complicated, because we can't, these options aren't an array. We could set them up as an array. You know, we could do an options property with number, string, boolean, undefined. But I actually chose a more difficult way of setting up our options as individual properties. Now going with the array might be a better way to do it, but right now let's follow through. The inner text of each button needs to be questions at the 0 index, and then we need to access the property of option plus the relevant number. So I'm going to use a different kind of notation to access object properties. You know what? No, this is getting too complicated. I don't want to throw more at you than is necessary right now. So let's do the array. And correct is going to be string. Alright, nice and simple here then. Let's change this to questions. Yeah, there is another way of referring to properties inside objects, and it's not too hard, but I do want to keep things fairly contained to what we've actually gone over in class. So questions 0 index dot options dot length, because this is an object. This is an array. This is an object. This is an array. This is a number. Okay, this is once again brings us back to understanding what data type you're dealing with at any point in time. Follow the breadcrumbs from one side of the expression to the other. So, new button.enter text equals questions at the 0 index dot options at the I index. So that'll create 4 new buttons, and each button's inner text will be equal to a different string inside each options property, the options array of that particular question object. So we're just doing this for the first question object right now, so obviously. But we will refactor this so that it does the same process for every question. Okay, so what else do we need? We're going to need, actually that should do it. Let's create a submit button as well. Nah, forget it, no submit button, just the multiple choice buttons. Now, each button is going to need some kind of on-click attribute. Something's going to need to happen when you click on one of these buttons. But if you click on the right button, it needs to be different than if you click on the wrong button. So, let's do an if statement. If questions at 0 index dot options at the I index equals questions at the 0 index dot correct, then that means we've just created the correct button. And that button is going to have an on-click attribute, which for now let's just have it an alert that says correct. Otherwise, if it's the incorrect button, or one of 3 incorrect buttons, it's going to say not correct. Okay? And at the end of our for loop, we are going to append each new button to new div. We're also going to append new h1 to new div. And after the for loop, we're going to append new div to our body. And now we have our very beautifully styled quiz. Let me go ahead and get rid of these. Just in C++ mode for a minute there. Okay, so what data type does the following evaluate to? Hello.length plus 0. Well, it's a string. It says correct. Good. I click on undefined. It says not correct. Good. So the buttons are working. Everything's working so far. But what do we really want to happen when you click on the correct button? We want it to jump to the next quiz question, right? So, a couple different ways to do this. How about when you get a question correct, it's going to remove that object, that first object, from the questions array. So if you don't remember how to remove the first object from an array, you jump into your console and try it. Oops, let me put it in an array, in a variable first. MyArray dot unshift. Didn't do anything. MyArray dot shift. Now let's take a look at it. It removed A. It removed the first item in the array. So shift is the array method that we're going to need. Array methods are at the tail end of the weeks that we're covering here. But this is one of multiple ways to handle this. You could also handle it by using a counter variable. But I'm going to stick with unshift first. So let's say if it's the correct question, then an onClick event is going to trigger a function called correct. Okay? Function called correct. So let's go ahead and define that function. First of all, we know that correct is going to shift the first item out of the questions array. But then we need it to run through all of this again in order to populate the new question. So let's go ahead and put this inside a populate HTML function. Okay. And when we get a question correct, first we're going to remove the first object from questions, and then we're going to execute populate HTML again. Now all we need is to execute populate HTML when the page loads, so we see that first question. And if I click on string, correct answer, it brings up the next question. So maybe this format's okay, where you pick the right answer and it shows the next question right below. Typo in here. But what I'd like to do is replace the question entirely. So to do that, let's go ahead and empty out the content of the body. When populate HTML is run. So once again, we have our first question, pick the right answer, and we have our next question. Pick the right answer, and we have our third question. And then we're done. Let's get rid of that automatic populate HTML function and instead put it inside a button that says Start Quiz. And the onClick event is going to invoke populate HTML. Start Quiz. And then we get our first question. Okay? And then let's say if you finish, so if questions.length equals 0, if all of the question objects have been shifted out of the questions array, then we're just going to have an alert that says, you've completed the quiz. Congratulations. Start quiz, string, number, boolean. You've completed the quiz. Congratulations. And we're done. Very simple quiz app, built entirely with JavaScript. And one function, populate HTML, run over and over again for each question. See how? Okay, I know this is a lot of stuff that we've gone over today, and some of it may be more advanced than you're used to, but that's kind of the point. You know, it's an excuse to give you a lot more experience with syntax that we've used quite a bit already. Dot notation, variable declaration, function declaration, square brackets for indexes, and most importantly, using objects, using data in the form of objects. That's the most important thing we will ever have to do as front-end developers. So, any questions so far, guys? Now's the time to ask if you do have any, because if you're unclear on anything, it can be as fundamental as, what is a Boolean or what is a Boolean for. Doesn't matter to me. Just shout it out. Set a transition property on our body as well, and see if that, no, it doesn't do anything. Alright guys, well, that's pretty much all the official material I have for you. There are plenty of practice exercises we can do on the simpler side if you're just looking for practice with for loops, functions, utility functions. Fact of the matter is, and this goes not just for you guys watching, but you guys who may be watching the recording later on, the more quiet and unresponsive the audience, the less inclined I am to keep doing these. Because otherwise it's me talking to myself and going over code that I already know for 2 hours in a glass cubicle. So if you plan on attending these in the future, if you're watching these later, consider that. The more questions you ask, the more vocal you are, the more likely I am to continue them. And the goal is to continue them every week. If you're watching these in the future and concerned about sessions where you won't be able to make it, I announce them well in advance. There's no reason why you can't shoot me questions over Slack ahead of time, and I can address them in the recording. I can address them during the session. Alright, so I'm down to 2 of you here, 9 minutes left. If you guys don't have any questions, then I'm just going to call it there and slink away. Alright, then I guess that's that. Thanks to all of you who attended, and I hope this was at least a little bit helpful. Sorry if it got a little more complicated than you were hoping for, but if so, let me know. Tell me that this one, went off the rails. Tell me that this wasn't what you expected or were hoping for. Tell me, and the next time I can prepare accordingly. We can change how this goes. We can make it about whatever it is that you need it to be about or want it to be about. But if you say nothing, I can't help you. All right, well, that's it. See y'all.